Most people do not decide to stop eating ultra-processed food because they had a revelation. They decide because something stopped working. The energy that used to get them through the day started requiring more coffee to maintain. The sleep that used to feel restorative started leaving them foggy. The skin that used to be manageable started acting up again. The mood that used to be fairly stable started dipping for reasons that did not add up. And at some point in the middle of all of that, they looked at what they were actually eating, really looked at it, and thought, maybe this is connected. Maybe what I keep putting into my body every single day is doing something I cannot see. If you have had a version of that thought, even a quiet one, even one you dismissed quickly, I want you to stay with it for the next few minutes. Because that thought was not paranoia. It was your body being smarter than the food industry would prefer. What I want to walk you through today is something specific. Not a general conversation about eating better, not a lecture about what you should and should not put in your body. Something more precise than that. I want to tell you exactly what happens inside you, inside your cells, your gut, your brain, your hormones, your skin, your sleep, when you remove ultra-processed food from your life for 21 days, day by day, system by system. Because the timeline is real, and understanding it changes everything about how you experience the process. Most people who try this quit in the first week because they do not know what is happening to them. By the end of this conversation, you will know. And knowing is what makes the difference between giving up and understanding that what you are feeling is not failure. It is your body beginning to change. But before we get into the timeline, I need to make sure we are talking about the same thing. Because ultra-processed food is a term people think they understand, and most people only understand half of it. Ultra-processed food is not just junk food. It's not just the obvious things, the fast food, the chips, the candy, the soda. Ultra-processed food is a category defined by how it is made and what's in it, not by how obviously unhealthy it appears. The formal definition, developed by researchers at the University of São Paulo, describes it as food that has undergone extensive industrial processing and contains ingredients that do not exist in a home kitchen. Not just salt and sugar and oil. Ingredients like sodium styrylyl lactylate, carboxyl methylcellulose, partially hydrogenated soybean oil, maltodextrin, artificial flavors synthesized in a laboratory to trigger specific reward responses in your brain. Emulsifiers that keep texture stable on a shelf for months in ways that have nothing to do with nourishment and everything to do with profit. The category includes things most people consider relatively harmless. Flavored yogurt with a long ingredient list. Most breakfast cereals, including the ones marketed as healthy. Packaged bread that stays soft for 2 weeks. Flavored instant oatmeal. Most protein bars. Many plant-based meat alternatives, bottled salad dressings, microwave meals, fruit juices with added ingredients, most flavored coffees from chains. The lines are not always where people expect them to be. In many countries, ultra-processed food now makes up more than 50% of total daily caloric intake. In the United States, the figure is closer to 60%. Which means that for a significant portion of the population, the majority of what they eat every day was engineered in a laboratory, designed for maximum palatability and optimized for shelf life rather than biological function. And the body, which was built over hundreds of thousands of years to process whole food, is being asked to run on something fundamentally different from what it was designed for. The consequences of that mismatch are what most people are calling their normal. Now let us talk about what happens when you stop. Day by day, week by week, all the way through to day 21. The first 3 days are the hardest. Not because removing processed food is physically dangerous, but because your brain has been conditioned. Ultra-processed foods are specifically designed, and I use that word deliberately, to activate the dopamine reward system more intensely than whole foods. The combination of precise sugar-to-fat ratios, engineered flavor compounds, and texture profiles that dissolved quickly enough to allow continuous eating without triggering fullness were not accidents of taste preference. They were developed through decades of food science research aimed at finding what the industry calls the bliss point, the exact formulation that makes your brain want more before it has finished what it has. When you remove those stimuli, your dopamine system, which has been calibrated to expect those spikes, responds with withdrawal-like symptoms, irritability, cravings that feel urgent and specific, headaches, particularly if caffeine was embedded in your processed food intake through sodas or energy drinks, a low-grade restlessness that is hard to place. Here is what most people do not know. That discomfort in the first 3 days is neurochemical, not nutritional. Your body has plenty of fuel if you are eating whole food. What is struggling is your brain's reward circuitry recalibrating to a world where the dopamine hits are less intense and less frequent. This is the same mechanism that makes any habit difficult to break in the first 72 hours. You are not sick. You are not failing. Your brain is simply protesting the removal of something it learned to expect. Understanding this does not eliminate the discomfort, but it completely changes what the discomfort means. Days 4 through 7 bring something unexpected that most people do not anticipate. The hunger changes. Profound cravings begin to quiet in ways that feel almost suspicious, not because you have more willpower on day 6 than you did on day 2, but because the appetite hormones that ultra-processed food disrupts have begun to re-stabilize. Specifically, the hormones ghrelin and leptin, hunger and fullness respectively, begin returning to their natural rhythm. Ultra-processed food, particularly food high in added sugar and refined carbohydrates, produces insulin spikes that interfere with leptin signaling. When your brain can't read leptin properly, it can't register fullness reliably, which means you can eat past genuine need without ever feeling satisfied. As insulin patterns stabilize in the first week, leptin sensitivity begins to recover. And for many people, this is the first time in years that their hunger has felt logical. They eat, they feel full, and the fullness lasts. It sounds basic. For a lot of people, it's a revelation. Your gut is already shifting by the end of the first week, though you cannot feel most of what is changing. The microbiome, the trillions of bacteria living in your intestines, begins responding to the dietary change within 48 to 72 hours. Ultra-processed food is low in fiber, and many of its additives are directly problematic for gut bacteria. Emulsifiers in particular, like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethylcellulose, have been shown in research to disrupt the mucus layer that lines the intestinal wall and to alter the composition of gut bacterial populations in ways associated with increased intestinal permeability and systemic inflammation. When those emulsifiers stop coming in, that disruption stops, and the fiber from whole foods begins feeding the bacterial populations that produce short-chain fatty acids, compounds that repair the gut lining, reduce inflammation, and support everything from immune function to mood regulation. The bloating that many people have accepted as their permanent condition begins to shift in the first week. Not always dramatically, and not for everyone in the same way, but the kind of chronic, low-level bloating that comes from a gut microbiome under constant stress begins to ease as the stress is removed and the rebuilding begins. If what I am describing sounds like your life, the cravings, the hunger that does not make sense, the bloating, the way certain foods never quite satisfy you, I want you to take a look at the Body Hidden Signals Guide in the pinned comment below. It goes much deeper into what your gut and your hunger hormones are communicating through the signals most people ignore or misread. A lot of people who find it say it was the first time they understood their body's patterns instead of just being frustrated by them. Week 2 is where the changes become undeniable, and it is also the week where most people who have stayed the course begin to feel genuinely different rather than just deprived. The most commonly reported shift in week 2 is energy, not the jittery, unsustainable peak of caffeine or sugar, but something more foundational. A steadiness that most people do not have a recent memory of because they have been riding a blood sugar roller coaster for so long that the peaks and valleys have become their definition of normal. When refined carbohydrates and added sugars are removed from the diet, blood sugar stabilizes. Insulin stops spiking and crashing multiple times a day. Cortisol, which rises in response to blood sugar drops, stops being triggered unnecessarily. And the result is an energy floor that simply does not disappear at 2 in the afternoon. The afternoon crash, the one most people manage with coffee or something sweet, begins to reduce significantly in week 2. Not because you are sleeping more or exercising differently, because the biochemical cause of the crash has been removed. Cognitive clarity also shifts noticeably in week 2. For most people, this one surprises people the most because they did not realize fog was their baseline until it began to lift. Neuroinflammation, inflammation that reaches the brain, is significantly driven by systemic inflammation that originates in a compromised gut. The inflammatory compounds that enter the bloodstream through a permeable gut lining can cross the blood-brain barrier and directly affect cognitive function, mood, and mental speed. As the gut begins to repair and systemic inflammation decreases, many people experience improvements in concentration, word retrieval, mental speed, and what they describe as a lightness of thinking that they had not felt in years. Some people call it their brain coming back online, and that description is more physiologically accurate than it might sound.
Sleep begins to change in week 2 as well. Ultra-processed food affects sleep through multiple channels simultaneously. High added sugar intake is associated with more frequent nighttime awakenings and lighter sleep architecture. The gut-brain axis, the direct communication highway between your intestinal microbiome and your central nervous system, influences the production of serotonin, the precursor to melatonin, which is your primary sleep hormone. Roughly 90% of your serotonin is produced in the gut, not in the brain. When the gut microbiome is disrupted, serotonin production is disrupted. When the microbiome begins to recover, serotonin production stabilizes. And this is part of why people who remove ultra-processed food for 2 weeks start reporting not just deeper sleep, but also a stabilization of mood that feels connected to the sleep, but is also independent of it, because serotonin affects both simultaneously. The skin is its own conversation, and it deserves to be taken seriously, because skin changes are among the most visible and most motivating shifts people experience in this process. Skin inflammation, acne, eczema, redness, dullness, irregular texture is strongly connected to gut health and to the systemic inflammation that flows from a diet high in ultra-processed food. The mechanisms are multiple. High glycemic foods, which are ubiquitous in ultra-processed products, spike insulin and simultaneously increase a compound called IGF-1, which directly stimulates sebum production and skin cell proliferation, both major drivers of acne. Systemic inflammation affects the skin barrier and inflammatory skin conditions. And the gut-skin axis, which research is increasingly mapping in detail, means that changes in gut bacteria directly produce changes in skin inflammation. Most people begin noticing skin changes in week 2, not dramatic transformation, because the skin has its own renewal cycle and real change takes longer, but a reduction in new breakouts, a change in texture, a clarity and evenness of tone that begins to emerge as inflammation decreases. People who have spent years trying topical solutions to skin problems and never addressed the internal origin of those problems often find that 21 days of dietary change does more for their skin than months of products, because the source of the inflammation was never on the surface. Week 3 is when the integration happens. By day 15, the withdrawal is fully resolved. By day 18 or 19, the new eating patterns had begun to feel less like discipline and more like preference. Something that surprises almost everyone who reaches this point is that their taste has shifted. Foods that used to taste flat without the amplified flavoring of processed products begin to taste more complex, more interesting, more genuinely satisfying. A ripe tomato tastes like something. A piece of dark chocolate with no added emulsifiers has layers to it. Real food begins to taste real in a way that it did not when the palate was calibrated to hyperpalatable engineering. This is not a metaphor. Taste perception is physiologically influenced by chronic exposure to artificial flavor compounds. The taste receptors on your tongue recalibrate based on what they consistently receive. When the extremely intense artificial stimuli are removed, the sensitivity of those receptors recovers. The same food genuinely tastes different, tastes more, because the system that was interpreting it has returned to its natural baseline. People who go through this process and then try the processed food they used to love regularly report that it tastes artificial, too sweet, too intense, not because the food changed, but because they did.
By the end of week 3, something important has happened to the relationship between food and mood that goes beyond the physiological mechanics. Most people discover for the first time with real clarity how much their emotional state was being influenced by what they were eating. The mood dips that seemed random, the anxiety that had no clear source, the irritability that arrived in the afternoon, the low-level sadness that shadowed certain days without reason. When these lift, and for many people they lift meaningfully over 21 days, the realization that food was driving them is both liberating and, honestly, a little unsettling, because it means that a significant portion of what they had been attributing to their personality, their stress, their life circumstances, was actually biochemistry. Was the inflammation talking? Was the microbiome disruption talking? Was the blood sugar roller coaster talking? That realization does not mean your emotions are not real. It means they were being amplified and distorted by an internal chemical environment that was not supporting you. And the difference between your mood on a whole food diet with a recovering gut and your mood on a diet of 60% ultra-processed food is, for many people, the difference between a life that feels manageable and a life that feels like you are always slightly behind yourself. I also want to be honest with you about the things that do not fully resolve in 21 days, because this conversation would not be trustworthy if it sounded like a transformation advertisement. 21 days is genuinely meaningful. It is long enough for measurable changes in gut bacterial populations, for significant reduction in inflammatory markers, for meaningful stabilization of blood sugar and insulin patterns, for real improvement in sleep architecture and cognitive clarity. These are documented, studied changes, not anecdotal ones. But 21 days is not the end point of anything. It is a beginning. The gut microbiome has remarkable plasticity, but deep restoration after years of disruption takes months, not weeks. Insulin sensitivity improves quickly, but continues improving over a longer arc if the dietary changes are maintained. Gut lining repair begins rapidly. The epithelial cells that form the intestinal wall turn over roughly every 3 to 5 days, but deeper structural damage takes sustained time. And the brain's reward circuitry, while it recalibrates significantly in 3 weeks, continues adjusting for months as the new pattern becomes the established baseline. 21 days also does not automatically produce a permanent change unless the knowledge that comes with it is carried forward. The people who do 21 days and then quietly slide back into old patterns, usually gradually, usually starting with just one exception here and there, typically find themselves back at their original baseline within 4 to 6 weeks. Because the body is dynamic, it responds to what you consistently give it. The microbiome you build over 21 days is maintained by what you continue to feed it, and diminished by what you repeatedly take away from it. The reason I tell you this is not to make 21 days feel pointless. It is the opposite. 21 days is the most important window because it is where the subjective experience changes enough that continuation becomes motivated by feeling rather than discipline. It is where your body gives you enough evidence to understand, through your own lived experience and not just intellectual argument, that this is worth continuing. The goal of the 21 days is not to finish 21 days. The goal is to feel enough difference that you stop needing to be convinced. There is one more thing I want to say, and I want to say it plainly because it is something the wellness conversation around processed food often dances around without landing on directly. Ultra-processed food is not a personal failure. The people who eat it are not undisciplined or uninformed or careless about their health. Ultra-processed food is engineered at a biological level to override the signals that would otherwise cause you to stop. The bliss point is not a marketing concept. It is the output of serious scientific research aimed at finding the precise combination of ingredients that will suppress satiety, amplify reward, and create a pattern of consumption that feels like preference but is actually something closer to programming. The industry that produces this food has spent decades and billions of dollars understanding your brain's reward system better than most people understand their own. When you eat it and cannot stop, that is the intended outcome. When you feel pulled toward it even when you are not hungry, that is the designed response. When you try to reduce it and find yourself failing repeatedly, that is not a character flaw. That is an engineered food product performing exactly as designed against a human nervous system that was not built to resist it. Understanding this does not give you a pass on your choices, but it does change the framing. Because if you have been treating your relationship with ultra-processed food as a willpower problem, you have been trying to solve a neuroscience problem with a character solution, and those two things are not the same. The actual solution is knowledge and environment. Removing the products from your home so that default becomes whole food. Understanding what is happening in your body when the cravings hit, so that you can wait them out with comprehension rather than fighting them with guilt. Building the nutritional environment in which your brain stops generating the signals that drive the behavior. 21 days is enough time to do all of that. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but enough to feel in your own body the difference between the person you are inside a processed food environment and the person you are outside of it. And once you have felt that difference, really felt it in your energy and your sleep, in your skin and your thinking and your mood, the motivation is no longer about discipline, it is about preference. Because the version of yourself that exists on the other side of 21 days is genuinely different from the version that began them, and that person does not want to go back. Not because they are more virtuous, because they feel too much better to willingly choose otherwise. Your body has been working against a current that was not natural and was not neutral. For 21 days, you can remove that current and let it show you what it is actually capable of when it is not spending its resources managing something it was never designed to manage. That is not a small thing. That is your whole life feeling different. And it starts earlier than most people believe, changes faster than most people expect, and goes deeper than any number of before and after photographs could ever show. If you want to keep building on what we've talked about here, understanding the signals your body sends through cravings, fatigue, skin, sleep, and mood, and learning what each one is actually asking for, the Body Hidden Signals Guide in the pinned comment is exactly where I would point you next. It covers the full picture of what your daily habits are doing inside you, explained the way we've been talking here, clearly, honestly, without making it more complicated than it needs to be. Because the truth about your body is not complicated. It has just never been told to you in a way that made it feel like your own.